point, you will be able to identify and name the bones of the skull and their associated bones, and differentiate between the axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton, and differentiate between cranial bones and facial bones. So what is skeletal system? It is the system that is involved with forming the internal framework so that it can give the structure and shape to the body. While doing that, it also supports the body and it protects the body organs such as brain, heart, lungs, etc. It includes bones, cartilage, and bones are joined with each other by means of joints. It may be movable or immovable joints. And it also involved in body movements since it is anchoring with the skeletal muscles. So these are the two functions that are involved with the bone marrow cavity. The bone marrow cavity is filled with hemopoietic tissue that is involved with the production of the blood cells, red blood cells. Then it also involved with the storage of the calcium salts, which are very important for the vital activities. So if you go through the human body, the total number of bones are 206. Not kidding. Really, it is 206. So if you go for this many bones, how exactly they are being aggregated in what area? So if you go and shortlist all those ones, go for the skull and its associated bones, almost 29. Vertebral column, that means spine, your backbone, 26. Thoracic cage, the rib cage, 25. Shoulder girdle, that's here, is and it is associated with upper limbs, that's together it is 64. And your hip girdle, that is pelvic girdle, is associated with lower limbs, that comprises 62. So overall 206 bones together constitute the skeletal system. So how to study this, how to organize this, that's what. So the main parts of the skeletal system are two. One is axial skeleton, one is appendicular skeleton. Axial skeleton is the skeleton that is situated in the vertical and central axis of the body. It has skull, thoracic rib cage, and vertebral column. So if you go for the appendicular skeleton, these are the ones that form this skeleton for the appendages, and the girdles are the structures that attach the appendages to this main frame of the skeletal system. That comes under appendicular skeleton. So forelimbs, hand limbs, and shoulder girdle, hip girdle, they all come under appendicular one. Okay, so let's start the axial skeleton. This is the main skeleton for the system. It includes the bones of the head and the neck, chest, and the back, and it nearly constitutes 40% of the bones of the human body, and nearly 80 bones are involved in this. So it protects the brain, spinal cord, heart, and lungs. Basically, it is divided into three parts: skull and its associated bones, vertebral column, that is backbone, spine, and thoracic cage or rib cage. So in that picture, if you see, this entire region is the skull, and then this middle region of the thoracic one is the rib cage, and this entire back is nothing but the backbone. Okay, let's go to the sketch of the axial skeleton. Axial skeleton comprises 80 bones. Broadly, it is divided into three categories: skull and associated bone, that is 1, then thoracic cage, that is 2, and then vertebral column, that is 3. Then if you see this skull and associated one, it has got again two parts, that is skull and associated bones. Skull has got cranium 8 bones and facial bones, that are 14. Associated bones, if you see, hyoid is 1 single, then followed by auditory ossicles, that are 6. Then if you move on to the thoracic cage, that is formed by sternum, the chest bone that is single, then rib cage that is formed by 24 ribs. Then if you move on to the vertebral column, it is formed by the free vertebrae that are 24 apart from single structures, sacrum and coccyx. Sacrum and coccyx, even though they are single, but they are formed by the fused vertebrae that we will be discussing in a further class. So if you go for the next second one, appendicular skeleton, it is comprised of 126 bones, and it includes all the bones of the upper limb and lower limb and the girdles that are attaching these appendages to that of the axial skeleton. So basically it includes three characteristic parts, that is limbs that are appendages, followed by pectoral girdle that is nothing but shoulder girdle, followed by the pelvic girdle that is nothing but hip girdle. So if you go and see, the first one is the axial skeleton, where this entire area is the axial skeleton, and this particular area, these are the girdles, and followed by these limbs, and these are the girdles followed by these limbs. They all come under appendicular skeleton. Okay, so let's go to the appendicular skeleton. The sketch of this appendicular skeleton, if you see, it has got the 126 bones that are broadly classified into 4 categories. The first one is the pectoral girdle, second one is the upper limbs, third one is the pelvic girdle, and fourth one is the lower limbs. So if you see the pectoral girdle, that is the shoulder girdle, formed by 2 varieties of bones, clavicle and scapula. And next, upper limbs are formed by 60 bones, that includes humerus, radius, ulna, carpal bones, metacarpal bones and phalanges. Pelvic girdle is the hip girdle, formed by hip bones. Then followed by the lower limbs, again 60 bones are there, that comprises femur and kneecap, patellae and tibia, fibula, tarsal, metatarsal bones and phalanges. Okay guys, time for the checkpoint. So try to understand and answer these questions. Then we can move on to the next slide. Okay, let's go in detail about the axial skeleton. The first part, main one, is the skull and associated bones. So if you go for the skull has got cranial bones that are of 8, then followed by the facial bones that are of 14. So together total 22 bones are there. Followed by associated bones, 7 are there. So as you see the picture here, this whole skull, if you go and see, this whole thing is having the cranium that is involved with the protecting the brain, and followed by this whole posterior part is the facial bones. Okay, so let's go and discuss about the cranium. Already we know that cranium is formed by 8 bones. So what exactly this particular cranium is supporting? It is supporting the brain, and it has got the cavity that is fluid filled so that it can cushion, it can protect the brain from the external shocks. So if you see these bones, these are the 8 bones. If you go for this, as we move to this area, this entire area is the cranium. And if you go for this, frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid and occipital. So all these 4 are single unpaired structures, but as you go for this parietal and temporal, these are the only 2 bones that are paired structures. So total out of the 8, 2 bones are paired and 4 bones are unpaired. So varieties are 6, but total number is 8. So let's move on to the facial bones. The posterior part of the skull is, this is the area, they are formed by the facial bones. Anterior is formed by the cranium and posterior is formed by the facial bones. 14 bones that are involved in this formation. Basically it has got 3 functions. If you see in the picture, this is the entry spot for the respiratory tract and this is the entry spot for the digestive tract. And these facial bones, they give protection to these two entry spots. Apart from this is the area where facial muscles are attached to these facial bones so that they can have the control over the facial expressions. Then the last one is it also involved in manipulation of the food. So associated bones are 7 in number. So if you go for that, out of the 7, 6 are auditory ossicles that are situated in the ear. Each ear is having the 3 ear ossicles that we call it as auditory ossicles. So these are the 3 ear ossicles, malleus, incus and stapes. So 2 ears, they will have 6 auditory ossicles. Apart from that, at the neck region, you will be seeing one horseshoe shaped structure. That single bone is nothing but hyoid bone that is connected by ligaments to the temporal area of the temporal bones. So these two are being involved with attachment to the temporal bones, either if you go for the auditory as well as the hyoid bone. So if you happen to see the first one, that is cranial bones, how they are being aligned. As we see from the anterior view, this is the anterior view. As we go and check from the anterior view, you will be seeing 3 different bones. All of them are single bone. That is, one is frontal, one is sphenoid, and one is ethmoid. So if you go for the frontal bone, it forms the anterior part of the cranium. That is nothing but forehead. And a part is involved with the roof of the orbit formation. Go for the second one, sphenoid. This is the one that is involved with the formation of the floor of the cranium, a part of it. And this is the one that connects this entire cranium to that of this facial bone. So this is nothing but a connecting link, we can say, connecting link between the facial bones to that of the cranial bones. Then its shape is also somewhat different. It is butterfly shaped and it acts like a cross brace so that it can strengthen the sides of the skull. Then as we move to this ethmoid bone, this is the one that forms the roof of the nasal cavity. So roof of the nasal cavity, this whole roof of the nasal cavity and the part of the medial wall of the orbit is formed by these ethmoid bones. And this ethmoid bone is very irregular shape and it lies just beneath this particular sphenoid. So cranium on the posterior view, if you see, it is formed by 3 bones: parietal, that is paired; temporal, that is paired; occipital, that is unpaired. So out of these 3, occipital is the one that is situated at the base, or you can say posterior end of the cranium, whereas parietal is the one that is situated at the superior surface and little bit on the lateral surface. But as you move to the temporal is the one, it's like connecting the parietal of the cranium, and it is also attached to the mandible, that is facial bones. And this temporal is the one that is involved with the protecting the sense organs of the internal ear. And this is located on the side wall, you can say. So if you go and see, this forehead is by the frontal and superior wall is by the parietal, and side wall or lateral wall by temporal, and the base is by occipital. So skull bones are joined with each other by means of sutures. Suture is nothing but thin lines that are joining these flat bones. There are 4 major sutures that are there. Sagittal suture is the one that is joining, this is the sagittal that is joining the 2 parietal bones, and coronal suture is the one that is joining this frontal bone to that of the paired parietal one, and the lomboid is the one that is joining this occipital to that of this paired parietal one. And the one that you cannot see in this picture is the squamosal that is joining the temporal bones that are on the side wall ones to that of the parietal bones. That is called squamosal. Okay, now time to check your understanding. Go through these questions and try to answer these questions. So if you check for the facial bones, this entire area is formed by the facial bones. So out of them, except vomer and mandible, rest of all the ones that are paired, you can see this, they are all paired except vomer bone and mandible. So it is formed by maxilla, palatine, lacrimal, zygomatic, nasal, inferior nasal conchae that are paired, and vomer and mandible that are unpaired. Let's go in detail about maxilla and mandible. Maxilla is the one that is upper jaw, and mandible is the one that is the lower jaw. Maxilla is formed by the two maxillary bones and where these upper teeth are being located. And the main point here is maxilla is attached to all the facial muscles except mandible. Therefore, this particular maxilla is known as keystone bone of the face. Whereas if you go for this particular mandible, it is the largest and strongest bone of the face, and this is having the attachment to the temporal bone of the skull, temporal bone of the cranium, and this carries the lower teeth. So let's move to the next one, palatine bones. These palatine bones are paired structures that are forming the posterior part of the hard palate. So if you see here, this entire part is called as hard palate. This is anterior part of the hard palate, and this is posterior part of the hard palate. Anterior part is formed by the maxilla, and the posterior part is formed by the palatine bones. Next is lacrimal bones. Lacrimal bones are these yellow colored structures, and they form this medial wall of the each eye orbit. So it has a groove so that it can help the tears to pass through it. So next bone is zygomatic bones. These are nothing but the cheek bones. They are paired structures and they form the lateral wall of the eye orbit. So if you see this whole area is eye orbit. So this eye orbit has got the lateral wall that is supported by these zygomatic bones, and it also forms the cheek bones. Next is the nasal bones. These are also paired structures. If you see this particular bridge-like structure, small rectangular bridge-like structures, these are called nasal bones. These are also paired structures, and they form the bridge of the nose. So next is vomer. That is single bone. It is forming the inferior part of the bony nasal septum, and which is situated in the median line of the nasal cavity. So if you see this, already we discussed, these are the nasal bone, and this particular one is the one that is vomer. Then apart from this curved structures that are seen, the curved turbinal like structures, these are nothing but the inferior nasal conchae that are paired structures. These are the one that are curved bones that are projecting from the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. Next, move on to the paranasal sinuses. These are nothing but the hollow portions of the bones that are filled with fluid situated around this nasal cavity. If you see in the picture, you will be seeing there are 4 different varieties of these sinuses: frontal sinus, ethmoid sinus, maxillary sinus, and sphenoid sinus. The function of these sinuses are nothing but to lighten the skull and amplify the sound that we make as we speak. The problem here sometimes is most of the infections that are related to this particular sinuses are called sinusitis. Why? Because this mucous lining of these sinuses are continuous with the lining of the mucous lining of the nose and the ear. So whatever the infections that are being carried to these particular areas will lead to sinuses. Therefore, we end up with infection called sinusitis. Next, move on to the skull associated bones. There are 2 varieties, First one is hyoid bone. This hyoid bone is single bone. This is situated in the neck region, and the very important point for this hyoid bone is this is the only bone that does not articulate with any other bone that is associated with the skull. And this shape is also somewhat different. If you see, this is like horseshoe shaped, and it is suspended in the neck region just above the larynx, the voice box. And even though it is in the neck region, it is closely associated with the temporal bones and this particular lower jaw, that is mandible. So therefore the functionality, if you see, it serves as a movable base for the tongue basically. Next is skull associated bones are 6 auditory ossicles, 3 on each ear. So this whole structure is the ear structure. So this particular one is called external ear, and this particular one is called internal ear, and this middle area is the middle ear. So in this middle ear you will be seeing there are 3 varieties of bones that are involved. One is malleus, incus, and other one is stapes. Out of this stirrup-like stapes is the one that is the smallest bone of the body. They are all included as skull associated bones. Okay, next we will discuss on cavity of the skull. Skull is continuous with vertebral column. So skull has brain, and vertebral column has the spinal cord. But this spinal cord emerges from the brain and it has to pass into the vertebral column. So if this is being enclosed within the skull, so skull should have an aperture so that the spinal cord should enter into the vertebral column. So that cavity is located at the base, that is situated at the base of the occipital bone, which we call it as foramen magnum. Okay, time for you to check your understanding. I have given some fill in the blanks, so try to finish it. Quiz. So in this slide I have given some characteristic features of the bones, so you need to identify and write the name of those ones. Okay, now it's time for the labeling the diagrams. Okay, so that's it guys.